My name is Ian Wilson, and I serve as director of the Chester Ronning Center for the Study of Religion and Public Life here at the U of A's Augustana campus, for those of you whom I don't know. Welcome to the Gene and Peter Lockheed Performing Arts Center. This campus is located on land traditionally known as Siniscau-Sapesis, or Stony Creek. This is Treaty 6 territory and a traditional meeting ground for many indigenous peoples. The land has provided a traveling route and home to the Musqueam, Nehiyuwak, Nitsitapi, Nakota, and Tsuut'ina nations, the Métis, and other indigenous peoples. Their spiritual and practical relationships to the land create a rich heritage for our learning and our life as a community here. In thinking about the land, the relationship between indigenous and settler peoples on it, and the ongoing process of reconciliation, I'd like to make two brief announcements about upcoming events before I introduce our guests today. First, next Monday and Tuesday, February 3rd and 4th, and you may have seen some of these events scrolling up here. This is not the event I'm going to speak about now, but maybe you've already seen the flyers for these events. Next Monday and Tuesday, February 3rd and 4th, the Ronning Center is co-sponsoring the visit of performance artist Adrian Stimson. Adrian is from Siksika First Nation in Treaty 7 territory, which is just south of us here. He'll be the guest of Dr. Aaron Sutherland and will be giving a talk about his art and will be performing some of his work actually right here in this room. And then on Wednesday, February 19th, the center is co-sponsoring a screening of the film Nipa Wista Masoen, We Will Stand Up, which is a documentary about the death of Colton Bushey, the young man from Red Pheasant First Nation who was fatally shot on a Saskatchewan farm in 2016. The filmmaker and Colton's sister will be in attendance, and Dr. Daniel Sims will dialogue with them after the film. So we hope you'll be able to join us for those upcoming events here in February. Today, our guest is Dr. Ingrid Mattson. Dr. Mattson is visiting the University of Alberta this week as a guest of the North Campus's Muslim Students Association. She's very busy with events up in Edmonton, so I'm delighted that she and the North Campus MSA were able to squeeze in a quick trip down to Camrose to spend time with us here. An expert on the Quran and on Islamic ethics and interfaith relations, Dr. Mattson is one of the foremost scholars of Islam in North America. She was educated at the University of Waterloo in Ontario and at the University of Chicago. She has held faculty positions at Hartford Seminary in Connecticut and at Huron University College at Western University in London, Ontario, where she currently holds the London and Windsor Community Chair in Islamic Studies. Outside the academy, Dr. Mattson has served as president of the Islamic Society of North America, notably the first woman to do so. And she has consulted with US, Canadian, and other world leaders in a variety of capacities on issues of Muslim civil rights. One of our mandates at the Ronning Center is to promote interfaith dialogue. Dr. Mattson is a leading exemplar of such work. Today, she will speak to us about the living tradition of Islam. So please join me in welcoming her to Augustana.
All right, good afternoon. How you doing? This is a great space. Wow, you guys are very fortunate. It's such a beautiful performance space and gathering space. Lovely day coming down here. I saw the sun for the first time in about 3 months. Southern Ontario, we just sort of get gray in the winter now. So I just love being here. I want to thank those who made it possible for me to come here to the Chester Ronning Center, to Ian and Diane and all of those who facilitated this, and then the students, the Muslim students from University of Alberta in Edmonton. Today, I knew it would be an eclectic mix of people, and some of you may have no familiarity with Islamic thought and culture and history, and others may be very familiar. So it's always a bit of a challenge to think about what to present. And so today, really, when I talk about the living tradition, what I'm proposing to do is to explore the ways that that barriers are created to understanding each other And also there are opportunities for opening up knowledge through the living tradition. What do I mean by the living tradition? I mean the people, the people of a tradition. The people who continue interpreting that tradition and living that tradition and passing it down to each other. It's interesting that very often in circles where we talk about interfaith dialogue and also interfaith engagement, we will hear people say that the best way to bring peace and harmony and understanding is by the personal encounter, the person-to-person encounter, to get to know someone from another tradition. And I believe that's true to a large extent. However, we also have to acknowledge that there is no naive encounter. And what I mean by that is that even though we may believe that we don't know anything about another tradition or another culture, nevertheless, all of us, each of us has been formed by historical traditions. We're passive recipients of news and information. Whether we realize it or not, we already have certain ideas about other people. And it's through those ideas, those constructs, those filters, through which we may consciously or unconsciously decide whether to accept information, whether to really embrace the personal encounter as something that is authentic or really imbued with a great deal of suspicion. We hear a lot today about implicit bias, right? And implicit bias, interestingly, is something that not only affects how we look at the other, but it even affects the very, people within their own tradition, because we are all, while we're members of a community, we're also members of the greater community, also subject to all sorts of images and news and the way that it's framed. In the Islamic ethical tradition, there's a distinction made in epistemological studies, so the study of how we know something, right? How do we know something's true or right? How do we legitimize it or say that this is not true or inauthentic? So there's a distinction that's made between two kinds of ignorance. One is called jahil basit and jahil murakkab. Jahil basit is simple ignorance. It's where we say, I really don't know anything about this topic. So for example, I don't know anything about growing soybeans. I could just say, so if I met a farmer who grows soybeans, I could say, well, that's really interesting. So what is the cycle and what kind of environmental conditions do you need? And, I'm pretty much a blank slate when it comes to soy farming. But jahil murakkab, complex ignorance, is where we already believe we know something. We think we know something about it. And even if we haven't studied it. So, admitting a bias that I have when I encountered, the first time I encountered a person who is from Colombia, from the nation, the country of Colombia, immediately in my mind, I couldn't help it. What popped into my mind? Coffee, cocaine, and cartels. And there's this these ideas kind of pop in your mind. I'm just thinking, oh my God, what's wrong with me? I'm trying to push it back as I'm just trying to have this individual personal encounter with this lovely woman. So, we are not necessarily responsible for those implicit biases or those frames that come into our mind, but we are morally responsible for what we do with them. So that we have an ethical responsibility to understand how impressions are formed, how we gain knowledge, where we gain it from, and then what we should do when we realize that perhaps our impression is being really distorted. I mean, you are people who live in Western Canada, and I don't have to tell you that people who live in Ontario have stereotypes about people who live in Western Canada. Where does that come from? Different news and all sorts of things. And it's the responsibility of any adult, mature person, moral person, to really try to recognize that and then deal with it. So when we talk about the living tradition of Islam and how, today I'm really looking at how do we together, especially in an educational environment, especially in an environment of knowledge and research, how can we bring in the living experience, the living tradition to academic study, to academic institutions. And to begin with, we need a little bit of history. So it's quite interesting when I hear when people talk about political conflicts, for example, very often they very loosely use terms like, oh, these people have been in conflict for thousands of years or something like that. And the story of human history is that there are always tensions, but there also are many stories of positive encounters where the encounter between different cultures or different traditions can lead to great synthesis, can lead to new learnings. So when we look at the pre-modern, the perception of pre-modern Islam and the encounter between Muslim peoples and the primarily Christian peoples of Europe, we find some very good stories. So for example, that we have people like Averroes, whose Arabic name is Ibn Rushd. So Averroes is someone who was very respected by the medieval Christian philosophical tradition. He was a philosopher and a physician, mathematician, and continued to be studied in European academies for not only for his preservation and transmission and interpretation of the Hellenic tradition, but also for his own developments and unique ideas that he contributed to that tradition. We see that in the pre-modern tradition, there was really, in many cases, very productive exchanges, intellectual and academic exchanges that came through the pre-modern universities or colleges and universities. So this is a typical, this building's still not in use as a college, but one of the great pre-modern Islamic colleges. And even the structure of the European colleges, the first universities of Paris, Bologna, and then Oxford and Cambridge, a lot of research has been done to show that those who founded those universities took many of the models from the medieval Islamic world, which had universities that preceded Europe. So the idea even of the academic chair, for example, it was a literal chair that was placed for the professor in medieval Islamic academies, and then that was transferred over by the Europeans. Interestingly, most of that knowledge and encounter came through the wake of the Crusades. So you have a kind of negative encounter, but you also have positive cultural production from that. We know that in those pre-modern encounters, it's not only knowledge, but art, music, learning. So for example, the guitar or the stringed instrument originally comes from West Africa and medieval Spain and was transferred over. And the music, the scales, many of them came from this encounter. So this is a very positive thing. And interestingly here we see these two gentlemen sort of jamming together. Looks good. They could almost be playing in a space like this while people are sitting around in their cafes. Now you see they're wearing distinctive dress, and even one has lighter skin. The European has lighter skin than the Muslim, who has brown skin. But it's a positive encounter. But we see the beginning of a difference that's not only religious difference. These are people coming from two different religious traditions, but also have some physical differences. But there's a neutral attitude really in this depiction towards those differences, right? It's just they're together jamming, and they look a little different, but there's a equality, there's a mirroring of their body language. Really, it's really at the time of the Reconquista that we begin to see a deep racialization of Islamic identity. And in fact, while many people will say that the Crusades sort of were the encounter that created sort of a lasting negative political identity between sort of Muslim majority countries and Christian European countries, I really believe that's not the case. The Crusades were simply political conflicts that went up and down, and you don't really see in the Islamic literature that it had a kind of really lasting negative effect in the way that the Reconquista did. Because the thing about the Reconquista was that it was the first time that we saw an empire or a dynasty insist that all of their citizens had to follow the religion of the king. So this is why all of the Jews and all of the Muslims who were in Spain either had to convert or leave. And so this multi-religious, multicultural, it wasn't a utopia. No human place is. No dynasty, no empire is a utopia. I don't want to romanticize that. But there certainly was never a sense that that the ideal state is one in which difference is erased. Yes, there may be hierarchies. There may be some who were the preferred group, but they shouldn't be erased. So really, it is at the time of the Reconquista in Spain that view that all of those who are under the one sovereign should follow the same faith. And then we know that many Christians suffered as well in the Inquisition. And then we have this, Reformation and counter-Reformation encounter. But one of the things we see here, and I could have shown you many pictures of, famous pictures of great paintings, European paintings, Spanish paintings, showing Santiago, St. James, who's the patron saint of Catholic Spain, slaying the Moor, which is the typical paradigmatic image of Santiago. Santiago slaying the Moor, which is Mauritania, the Moors. It's an area of North Africa, so it's a region of North Africa. But in the Christian West, it became a title applied to Muslims generally, just like in sort of the Eastern Europe. All Muslims were called Turks because they were the ethnic group that they encountered. So here we see St. James is trampling a Moor under his feet, and we see also the skin color difference. And it really is at this time there's a racialized element to that's sort of added on top to the element of the religious difference. This is actually just I found this picture as a little kind of a lovely souvenir that is sold as a for those who want a little souvenir of Santiago, whose full name is Santiago Matamoros, which means the Moor killer, right? So negative encounter, and what's really important here is that the time of the Reconquista, I really think is we all have to acknowledge that this is really the beginning of the modern world, because it was Ferdinand and Isabella who then sent Christopher Columbus on his exploration of the New World and really opened up that chapter in history. And what's very interesting is to read about how the Spanish, when they encountered indigenous people, and this is relevant for us as Canadians and with our ethical obligation to engage in truth and reconciliation, is that when the Spanish encountered indigenous people, that they very often or most commonly saw them through the frame of their experience with the Moors. And so they even sometimes, they would call their temples mosques. So they described the temples of indigenous people in the sort of Central American lands as mosques. And they applied many of the same frames to them in trying to understand their belief system, their religious practices, their spiritual practices. So right away, there was, we think, well, here are Europeans who are coming and encountering indigenous people for the first time, again, as if it's a naive encounter. But in fact, they were encountering the indigenous people through their experience, their previous experiences of the other, and really imposing those frames in many ways on the indigenous people. Here's a map of Francis Drake's map of different trade routes, and one thing that we can see here is what scholar of this period, Nabil Matar, calls the Renaissance Triangle, which is the movement between England, West Africa, and North America. And it is through this triangle of trade, exploration, discovery, and exchange that, again, we find this kind of conflation between Muslims and indigenous people, and many of the same kind of stereotypes or forms of othering applied to both indigenous peoples of the North and South America, of the Americas, and Muslim people. This opens up a whole period of time of study of the other. And in this, the few centuries when European colonialism and exploration is ongoing throughout the Americas, so we have the indigenous people being encountered, and then also European colonization that is expanding across Africa and Asia, we see the same kind of frames that are being used to understand and encounter the people. So the idea of the exotic, this is a very famous study by Edward Said called Orientalism, which was published over 30 years ago, and really helped show what these frames were, and that continue to operate over time. So the idea that the people are exotic, that they are irrational, and of course rationality in a philosophical tradition, certainly reason by the Greek philosophers was considered to be the defining characteristic of a human being. This is what distinguishes a human being from all other living creatures. It is reason. So by applying the judgment of irrationality to indigenous people, to Muslim people, you are making them less than human. More childlike, for example, in need of governance, in need of direction, in need of education. Also, sexual deviance is something that was constantly being applied to both indigenous people and Muslims. And they were considered to be not capable of studying themselves or explaining who they were. So this is where this intersects with the idea of living tradition versus textual tradition. Who is the expert in what a people's spirituality, teachings are? And what's very interesting is we find that this, in these periods in early modernity, it is a very strong attempt to say these people are incapable of being objective about their own tradition. So the native informant, the person who's living the tradition, has no role in actually teaching about that tradition or explaining what it is. It's the other who is rational, who is going to explain what that is. For women have a big part in this. Among those who are the most exoticized are the women of the other culture. And so we see there's a whole Orientalist tradition of painting poetry, literature that sees certainly the Muslim woman, the Chinese woman, as someone who is, and also indigenous women as being very sexually available, loose, do not have good morals. And then this whole idea of, well, a kind of voyeuristic language that's applied to it. So you'll find all of these books, beneath the veil, lifting the veil, under the veil, unveiling, like to be like uncovering the truth. So this idea that beneath there's something else. So this kind of voyeuristic view. What's interesting is that with this normative judgment of sexual deviance, it changes depending on the culture. So from the pre-modern European Christian perspective, indigenous women and Muslim women were too sexual, that in modern times the view is, oh, no, they're sexually repressed. So this is, how many of you ever watched the series Homeland? Homeland is a popular HBO series, right? So this was an advertisement for, I think, season 5 or 6 of Homeland. And it's that typical view, the Muslim woman is under these, completely covered, faceless, black veils. It is the white American woman who can show her face and is colorful. So you have a complete flip of the view of what is the sexuality of this tradition and of these women, but with the consistent that it is deviant or deficient in that sense. Interestingly, I took this screenshot through a Google search of Muslim women a couple years ago, and again, what comes up is just this, all of these, and not to say, there are women who wear all black, there are women who cover their faces, certainly not the majority of Muslim women, but to have a Google image search be completely dominated by this. But then what's really interesting is if you look at the categories at the top, what are they? So what's interesting about women? It's all about how they look. So you can have the subcategory of without hijab, with hijab, abuse, most beautiful, and clothing. So it's, the focus is so much on the appearance. Nothing about, famous Muslim women or Muslim women scientists, or it's so focused on this superficial impression. And it shows us that even if we're trying to search for good information, right? You get a neighbor or a new friend. You say, oh, I want to learn something about their faith, their tradition. You go on the internet, type in something, and here this is being set for you. The frame, how you should perceive, is really quite remarkable. The image of Muslim men also is not very good. So this is the cover of a Polish magazine from a few years ago. This is a popular, Polish language magazine. And as you'll see, this European, it's about, the cover story is about the Islamic threat to Europe. And as you see, this woman who is being attacked is not only being, ripped apart by these hands, but these are all brown hands who are pulling apart, attacking this white woman. So this racialized element, it shows that Islamophobia, again, has this very strong racial element. People will say, well, Islamophobia it's not racism, it's just I don't like Muslims. But there is a very, very strong racist element that is part of this. So this is kind of the bad news. Just another added part. One of the things that is that was very interesting is that when early missionaries were looking at Muslims and at indigenous people, one of the very common criticisms from a theological point of view, this is an article by Samuel Zwemer, who was one of the very prominent missionaries and publishers of the editors of the Muslim World Journal, which is the oldest English language journal devoted to the study of Islam, which is the journal that I co-edited 100 years later at Hartford Seminary when I was there. So it shows that things change. We're not all going to stay in the sort of difficult area. But this claim of animism. So this was a very strong critique of the missionaries who studied Islam and also studied the beliefs of indigenous people, that they were superstitious, that they were animists. So the beliefs of Muslims and indigenous people that all things are living, that there's an integrity and harmony and unity of life to all things, was characterized as animism, a kind of form of polytheism or disbelief. But this idea, and that animism is an irrational and superstitious belief, is unfortunately something that will pop up from time to time. So we had this very difficult period 10 years ago when, unfortunately, Pope Benedict, because of his eagerness to really reclaim because faith was really dropping off in Europe. I mean, the levels of belief of people who are practicing Christians in Europe is very, very low now. He was trying to convince Europeans that faith is part of European identity, which I think is true. I mean, when we see what Europe was built up on, Christianity is so important to the development of Europe and European institutions and law and morality, so many things. But unfortunately, sometimes by trying to promote that, he was saying, but these other faiths are not. So there was this kind of attack on Islam, saying that Christianity is a rational religion, a rational faith, and so European scientism and rationality and the intellectual tradition is really due to Christianity, unlike Islam, which is not rational. And again, it's interesting because I began this talk showing a picture of Averroes. So the medieval philosophical belief was that Islam had contributed a lot in terms of reason and logic and philosophy. It was a very unfortunate incident, and I'm going to show you at the end how it all turned out well in the end. I met Pope Benedict. There were initiatives taken after, and many positive things came out of this encounter. So hopefully I'm done from the difficult things, and this is really our deconstruction work. This is our work of saying, really trying to understand that we cannot believe that we will have a naive encounter. We first have to acknowledge the past, and then being able to say, well, what is the other view? What's very interesting is that at the founding of America, by the founding fathers of America, Benjamin Franklin and all of the others, they generally had a very positive view of Islam. They believed that Islam had been one of the great contributors to world civilization, and they saw America as being a country, a new nation that would take the best learning from every nation of the world, and would build a new society. And so this is just a shot of the dome in the Library of Congress. Have any of you ever been to the Library of Congress? Yes. It is just a fantastic building. It is amazing. It is the Library for Congress. It collects comprehensively. If you go to their website, if you ever want to research something, you go to their website. They do comprehensive collection. And in the dome, they have this beautiful painting of 9 different, what they characterize as civilizations who contributed to the development of human knowledge. And you see Greece, you see Judaism, Egypt, Rome, Islam. Here the contribution of Islam is in physics for some reason. In the place right now where they are, the U.S. legislature and the Congress and the Capitol, where the politicians, the legislators are debating laws and voting on debating bills, all around that building, if you go in the inside, and you watch the debates, just have a look, and all around the room on the wall are about 30 different medallions that are homages to people in civilization who have contributed to the development of law and legislation, and that America, wants to take the best from that. And one of them is Suleiman here. Suleiman, known as Suleiman the Magnificent, or Suleiman al-Qanuni, the lawgiver, for his contribution to reforming military and civil laws. And then on the U.S. Supreme Court, all at the top of the U.S. Supreme Court, there are friezes at the top that show those people throughout human history who have contributed to the development of justice. And a symbol of justice always is the sword, because justice, it can only be upheld if the person is held accountable, right? So there always has to be some force behind it. So we have Alexander and Justinian, and in the center is the Prophet Muhammad. So I think it's surprising to a lot of people that at the very founding of America, Islam was considered to be one of the great contributors to global civilization. And that shows us that we can tell different kinds of stories. There are stories where we can pull out simply conflict. We can also tell stories that show harmony, show mutual learning and mutual benefit. And I think it's important to remember, especially these last 3 slides, when we see about some of the things that are happening in, unfortunately, in the United States today. It's going through countries go through their ups and downs, and the United States, like some other countries, many other countries, is going through a kind of populist period where many people are finding themselves sort of pushed to the outside, but it's not necessary for that to be the story. Unfortunately, in the last couple decades, there's been so much extreme forms of violence, and what we find is, rather than learning from each other the best things, sometimes, and I'm sorry, this is a very shocking image, I should have given you a trigger warning, is that we find that there's a mutual sort of learning about how to be more and more extreme in the violence. So we have on the top left, we have prisoners at Guantanamo Bay, and then at the bottom, about 10 years later, we have these Muslim terrorists who have also, right, in a kind of homage to Guantanamo Bay, who have clothed their prisoners in the same orange jumpsuits. And so what happens is that there's always learning, and the learning can be about doing things that are beneficial or not. Just another point of what makes it challenging these days to really have that authentic encounter. Most of us, at least with young people, all young people, the first thing they'll do if they want to learn about something, as I said earlier, is to Google it. And unfortunately, the internet is not, we've come to know, just a neutral source of knowledge. That it is through, that people can really play with it so that certain things come up in searches, and they can create websites and integrate them in a way so that when someone searches something, they're going to find something that really is tailored towards their greatest prejudices. So we have something, there's been really important studies by American progressive institutions, research institutions, about how this has affected the internet and the availability to search for authentic information. It's really interesting that just recently, this is from the FBI, has verified that Facebook, and we hear a lot about Facebook these days, over the last few years, its Russian bots have weaponized Facebook so that Russian-controlled accounts bots and trolls and everything that affects the social media, what comes up in your Facebook news feed is really controlled by these bots and trolls that are automated to directly target people's curiosity and prejudices. So it makes it very challenging. And then the question is, well, then who speaks for Islam and Muslims? How can we actually have a positive encounter? And I'm going to move into the last part of my talk so that we have lots of time for discussion. What I want to say is that I am a Muslim who greatly benefited from my studies at the University of Chicago, studying in the Oriental Institute, this, tremendous building, facing some of those challenges where the question was asked, all right, how do we know what Islam is? And we had a very strongly textual tradition. So what we learned were the languages. I was in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations, had to write 5 different language exams, learn how to read manuscripts, how to do this kind of research. It was very beneficial, but it was somehow a little bit detached from my life as a Muslim living in a faith community. And so over time, they moved from things like, this is a Harvard Center for Middle East Studies, that Islam started to be taught in the seminaries, divinity schools, and theology schools, and that's where we started to see the living tradition come through. So when I graduated, I was hired at Hartford Seminary, and it was really very liberating in the sense that I was able to engage both with my textual knowledge and also my knowledge of the living tradition. And then that expanded. University of Chicago Divinity School and other divinity schools added Islamic studies. And we saw that Muslims in academia increased. So they started to be, the people who started teaching Islamic studies in academia were Muslims themselves and began publishing more and more. But we were together. It's not just you have to be a Muslim to teach Islam, but you certainly shouldn't be excluded from teaching Islam if you're a Muslim. So we started to have a real enrichment of the curriculum that included knowledge from insiders that interacted with the research methods and protocols of the academy to really have some very vibrant and interesting research that was happening. At the same time, the living tradition would continue to go on in places like there are Islamic retreat centers, there are traditional learning centers that are still outside of the academy, but nevertheless also are educating students in a traditional sense. This is actually a picture I showed last night in my presentation on the Quran. This is a picture of an American scholar named Hamza Yusuf who's teaching in the Great Mosque at Kairouan in Fez, Morocco. So he's teaching in the traditional style. You'll see he's sitting on that kursi. Remember I mentioned earlier the chair, right? A university chair of Islamic studies. He's actually sitting on that elevated chair, the literal chair, which is where the professorial chair first came from. Well, he began in this very traditional setting. As an American, he decided he wanted to set up an Islamic college or a Muslim college that really drew from the best of the Islamic tradition as well as the American Academy, and Zaytuna College was established in Northern California. And so you see here, what's interesting is there's a beauty to both, but part of the learning is this is a more democratic, in a way, learning environment. You see the professor is still the professor, still at the front of the class, but more on the level with the students. It's more conversational. There's teaching, but there's also conversation and discussion. It's not just a one-way learning process, which is the benefit of modern educational institutions. Students are given more of a voice. And what began as an attempt to sort of have a almost romanticized idea of a traditional learning environment really is explicitly saying the best, study the Islamic and Western intellectual traditions. So a real combination. And this shows how there's a mutual, it's possible to mutually benefit from the best of both of those areas. Cambridge Muslim College in Cambridge, the UK, is also a place that has been established 10 years ago that also has that interaction with Cambridge University and the traditional Islamic knowledge to really bring, to integrate both modes of learning and fields of knowledge, spiritual teaching in a way that is mutually beneficial to both. Just to finish off, the internet can also be a place that is positive, that can help us. And so there are places now where, not, in the old days it used to be distance learning, you used to get something in the mail and study something and mail it back. But now there are other places like Bay in Claremont, Southern California, that combines both in-place learning and distance learning. So I've taught for them where I do some online teaching and then go meet the students for a week in Southern California. And that's really beneficial. It also can be a place where women can have the opportunity to really engage in scholarship led by women. This is an amazing, really global initiative led by an American Muslim scholar, Rabata, which teaches thousands of women through this using the internet and distance learning, but a sense of community. And so what I really like about that is that you have people who are, it's open to anyone who's a woman, who can engage in this learning. And that emphasis, it's quite interesting because Tamara Gray, the scholar here, Sheikha Tamara Gray, herself spent over 20 years studying traditional knowledge in Syria. She also calls herself a Muslim feminist, meaning that she prioritizes women's value and life and knowledge. And so in that sense, we have a true integration of really the best of different approaches to knowledge. And I'm just going to end with this because I did talk about this unfortunate incident with Pope Benedict. But the response to that, what happened was a group of global Muslim scholars got together and decided to write a letter to Pope Benedict and to really, rather than simply react to something, and we're always, we want to avoid the cycle of just reacting to each other's things and saying, sort of, well, you started this, well, I said this because you did this. And in both individual and in a civilizational model, there was an invitation to say, look, let's come to a common word between us in our traditions. The core of our traditions is love of God and love of neighbor. And with that letter, which was signed and brought together by scholars really across the world, both Christian and Muslim scholars worked together to frame the letter and then the response to the letter. In the last 15 years, we've had incredible fruits from this initiative that have provided educational materials and frameworks for encounters so that we have both of these things. We realize that individual encounter, at the level of community groups, church groups, civic groups, is important, those encounters of getting to know each other, but there also has to be a sort of dealing with the misconceptions, realizing that there aren't naive encounters. The Anglican Church of Canada and the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Canada have just, I should have taken a screenshot and added it to this, but I wasn't able to do it. But just before I came here on Tuesday, there was a major celebration at my university. It happened to be held at my university at Huron College, where the Anglican Church of Canada and the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Canada launched a new website, acommonword.ca. So it's the Canadian Common Word Initiative, and it's that commitment for Canadian Muslims and Christians to engage in dialogue, understanding, and also working together for the common good, to demonstrate that love of neighbor based on mutual respect and understanding that all things come through the knowledge of God. So we reconciled with Pope Benedict. Unfortunately, he didn't stay in the position, but Pope Francis has been a wonderful, really wonderful ambassador, I think, globally for so many initiatives. I was there 2 weeks ago in a meeting with about 20 multi-faith leaders, Christians, Jewish leaders, and Muslim leaders. We met with Pope Francis at his residence to announce the launch of a new multi-faith initiative that will bring small groups of high-level religious leaders to intervene in places where there is religiously justified violence. So it's a really exciting new initiative, and I'm looking forward to being involved in that and bringing more of that knowledge and those models to my students and also to our community. So with that, I'm going to end so that we have time for some discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mattson. We have about 15 to 20 minutes for questions. We are on something of a tight schedule because, as I said, Dr. Mattson is a guest here at the university, and she and our guests from North Campus who came down have to head back up to Edmonton for further events that the Muslim Students Association have organized. And also they plan to participate in Friday prayers with the community here in Camrose, which start at 1:40. And so we want to make sure we give them time to get there for Friday prayers. But we do have some time for questions. I know there's some students here. I'd like to invite them, especially if they have questions, to speak up. But we'll get rolling and to give you an opportunity. And please do wait for me to bring the mic, just because, with the sound and things, it's best to use it. I see Peter's hand shooting up, so we'll start off with Dr. Berg.
Hi there, I'm Peter Berg, the chair of the science department. Two things. One was the Google, you show the image of the Google search, right? It would be very interesting to see how that varies with the user, because it's based on an algorithm of previous use of that browser, that machine, and IP address. So that I would encourage you to start a project on that, actually. Second thing, this is a question, of course. So when you said that Islam was related or correlated with physics, you said, is that physics or rather astronomy? Do you know?
Well, on the dome there, each one says, so it says Islam and it says physics. But what they meant by physics is, that's the question. The artist that did it. But it is absolutely true about the Google search. When I did that before I took the screenshot, I did, clear the browser and just to try to see what would come up, and it would differ according to country as well. Now, Google has worked on it since, so I think those searches will yield something different now. But we know that this is a concept. It's like an arms race, to be able to, to have these search engines produce a kind of, what kind of result it will give is just constantly changing, and the technology and the interference in it is no one can ever really keep up, which is why, of course, we always tell our students that it shouldn't be their first place to go.
Other questions?
Thank you for your presentation. One of the slides that you showed had a number of books. I noticed one of them was Thomas Jefferson's. Was that a critique on the Quran, or what was that a position at that time? Could you say more about that particular time in history and what that book might be about?
Right. Actually, Thomas Jefferson owned a copy of the Quran. He was an educated person, and This book is a book by Denise Spellberg, who's a scholar, about Thomas Jefferson's Quran. So why did Thomas Jefferson have a Quran? What was the view of the founding fathers of Islam? So that's what that book is about, and it's very interesting because Thomas Jefferson's copy of the Quran is in the Library of Congress, so it's in the collection of the Library of Congress, and when Keith Ellison was elected to the Congress, he's an African American. He was the first Muslim who was ever elected to the U.S. Congress. And there were some, Islamophobic attacks, like, oh, how could a Muslim be a member of Congress? Muslims don't believe in democracy, freedom, whatever, stuff like this. Kind of like when Kennedy was running for president, and how could a Catholic be the president of the United States when they owe their allegiance to the Pope, and all this anti-Catholic kind of view. Interestingly, it must have been one of the chief librarians at the Library of Congress, drew Keith Ellison's attention to Thomas Jefferson's Quran, so that when Keith Ellison took his oath of office, there's the oath, and then there's the symbolic ceremony where the member of Congress will put their hand on the Bible usually. So he actually swore his oath of office on Thomas Jefferson's Quran, right? So, because people were saying, well, is he going to swear his oath of office on the Quran? And what does the Quran say? And what does that mean? So, but he swore it on Thomas Jefferson's copy. So people were like, oh, really confused. Like for the people who didn't like the idea of a Muslim being a member of Congress, it was very confusing to them, because how could they criticize Thomas Jefferson? So it's very interesting,
First of all, thank you very much. So many things I want to pursue and learn more about. I'm speaking just as a former Canadian diplomat, and I started being a diplomat shortly after the 9/11 attacks, September 11th attacks, and around the same time that the Muslim Communities Working Group was first created at the Foreign Ministry in Ottawa, and kind of subsequently died a quiet death under the Harper government. But it was created originally with kind of two goals, I think. One was that they realized after 9/11 that a lot of the diplomats and others working in the foreign ministry knew very little about Islam and Muslim communities internationally. And the second was actually to formulate some ways of actually engaging better in diplomacy directly with Muslim majority countries and Islamic communities more broadly. And so, well, when I was a diplomat in the Middle East, things like, I forget who wrote the book, Hockey and Hijab, Shima Khan. She came and did a bit of a talking tour, and part of the idea was to engage in outreach to Muslim communities internationally, kind of talking about the experience of Muslims in Canada, and kind of describing what it's like to be a Muslim in Canada as a way to kind of promote Canada overseas, in a sense that can be a very positive experience in some ways. So my question is kind of, is there still room for that sort of diplomacy? Is there a need for it? But then also part of it is, and you touched on it at the end, is the experience of being Muslim in Canada and in the United States perhaps is leading to different, Muslims in those traditions have new and different things to offer to the broader traditions of Islam internationally as well. So the idea of a slightly more democratic, you called it teaching setting, for example. Are there ways in which, being Muslim in Canada is offering new things to Islam internationally? Right.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. So I was in the United States at that time, and the United States had many. U.S. State Department had those kind of initiatives as part of their cultural diplomacy or soft diplomacy, and would have American Muslims who were going on some of their tours and talking about being a Muslim in the United States. And what was interesting there is that what happened is a lot of the Muslims in the Middle Eastern countries said, yeah, that's fine. We have no problem with, it's fine. What we're talking about are political problems and the problem of, occupation or other things. We don't have any problem with America generally. And for Americans also, I think with American diplomacy, there is a kind of idea of American exceptionalism that sometimes was just people found very offensive. I do think, however, though, those kind of exchanges, if they're mutual, can be helpful to break down false dichotomies, like the idea like Islam versus the West. Those are two different categories of things. That's like saying apples versus basketballs. You're talking about fruit on one hand and sports on the other. There are lots of Western Muslims, right? So those are not two separate categories. You could be a Western Muslim, you could be an Eastern Muslim, you could be a Middle Eastern Muslim, you could be a South American Muslim. So just as Canadians who are Christian will have a very different culture, maybe even interpretation of the religion, the relationship between religion and politics than Christians in Mexico or Christians in Central African Republic or Christians in India. So I think that's where those things tend to go wrong. But I do think that more honest encounters are very helpful for breaking down like false dichotomies. That definitely is important. But I think that one thing that is, what's more effective is just simply making sure that your government and your administration and bureaucracy represents the diversity of the country. And we've certainly seen that in Canada now, is that I think there are, just Canadians of all different faiths and backgrounds are increasingly better represented in Parliament and also in the government. And I think that does the most to really counter a kind of any kind of ignorance that might be built in a system where the chief diplomats are, all from a particular social class or educational background.
Yeah, thank you. Very briefly, there's extremism in all religions. And of course, in recent decades, Muslim extremists have gotten a lot of attention. I guess I would like your comment on what relationship do you see between extremist behavior in all faiths and their actual religious beliefs, if there's a connection there, or if it's other cultural factors. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. It is, we live in a really, I think there have always been extremists, and there have always been people who have used religion or patriotism or racial superiority to justify violence against others. It's a very complex issue. There's psychological factors, there are social factors. I would say that, from a historical perspective, this kind of violence is not necessarily new, but what we do see today, it's in a way, it is like our challenge with the internet, is that our technology just heightens everything, right? Our technology heightens our ability to connect in a positive way. It heightens our ability to learn more, to expand, but it also allows misinformation to spread more quickly. It also allows for violent ideology to spread quickly. And even with military technology, it's nothing new that people have engaged in warfare or terrorist attacks, Caesar was killed in a terrorist attack, you could say. But there's a big difference in the amount of people you can kill with a dagger as opposed to, dynamite strapped to your body. So we live in an age where, because the technology has made, even if the risk is low, the consequence of an attack in this area is so high. It just, in my mind, this is one of the reasons why we have a moral obligation to put more work into understanding each other and into figuring out ways to counter misinformation, to counter the acceptance of violent ideology, and the spread of extremism. So even when it comes to this issue of, free speech, we don't want to regulate the internet. Well, it's true. We want the free flow of information, but when the technology is set up in a way to prioritize and really like accelerate misinformation and hate speech, then I think at that point there need to be some technological solutions and maybe legislative solutions to be able to prevent that, because it's not a normal situation. It's like, a bomb drops on people and something happens. A nuclear bomb drops and we're talking about generations of life that are damaged. So I think that in many ways, a lot of our issues that are just perennial in being a human being, that differences can be the source of tremendous, vitality and growth and synthesis, or differences can be exacerbated for violence. They've always existed, but the technological element just makes things so much more heightened, and the consequences of the negative, of the negative and violent and hateful views being spread are so much more damaging to all life on Earth, really. So I do think that we have more of a responsibility to pay attention and figure out how we can work to prevent these things.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mattson. Let's give her another round of applause. Thank you for sharing with us, for your graciousness. It is a very special treat to have her at Augustana today. We do have to run, so I apologize, but please be respectful. We're going to rush out of here so that they can make it to Friday prayers. And thank you again for coming. Please grab some extra food on your way out if you like, and we'll see you at our next event.